what do you think will happen to the rest of the Latin American countries that are aligned with Maduro's government in Venezuela if the United States manages to overthrow that government? Do you think the left will weaken? Well, the United States has indeed now overthrown that government. So this happened just a few hours ago. It is still nighttime there. And what's happened is that the United States military has gone in, and you had all these clips on social media of the US, launching airstrikes on Caracas, the Venezuelan capital. And then Shri Donald Trump ji, he has announced that they have abducted, or captured rather, the president of Venezuela, Mr. Nicolas Maduro, and apparently he is being taken to the United States, where he will stand trial, a free and fair trial according to the laws of the United States. Right? So apparently now the laws of the United States apply everywhere, at least in the Western Hemisphere, apparently. Right? So they went in. It's reminiscent of what the Americans did in the 1980s to Nicaragua. Nicaragua, when I was a kid in the 80s, was it 80s or 90s, whenever it was, the Americans went in and they abducted Manuel Noriega, who was the person who ruled Nicaragua at the time, and they took him to the United States and they charged him with drugs and whatnot, drug trafficking and whatever else, I suppose terrorism, drug trafficking, etc., etc., and they put him behind bars, and I suppose he is still behind bars somewhere in the United States. So that's what they've done to Venezuela. So the question is, what's the deal? What's going on? What's going to happen now? Right? To understand and what's the importance of all of this very rapidly evolving situation geopolitically, not just in the Western Hemisphere, not just for Venezuela, not just for Latin America, not just for the US, but for other nations, India, Russia, China, Asia, etc. What's the implications? So where do we begin this discussion? Let us begin by talking about the Monroe Doctrine and then the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So what is the Monroe Doctrine? It was in 1823 American foreign policy. Okay, and it declared that the Americas, North and South America, the Americas totally, cumulatively, were now closed to European colonization, and that any further European interference in the Western Hemisphere would be treated as a hostile act against the United States. Okay, that is 1823, early 19th century. That's when the Americans, started this foreign policy. And they pursued this foreign policy vigorously. Initially, they were not very powerful, but eventually, they were able to impose this all over the Western Hemisphere. So the 2025 National Security Strategy of the US, this document which has been published, the unclassified version, says that the US is going to revert to the Monroe Doctrine with a Trump corollary on top of it. So what is this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine? So it's this new interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. It extends the Monroe Doctrine. It says that the US now has the right, it's going to assert the right to police the Western Hemisphere against extra-regional powers like Europe, China, Russia, whoever else, and even against regional actors like the drug cartels and anyone who indulges in any drug activity, etc. You can allege this about anybody. So by doing this, the US will preserve its dominance over the region, the Western Hemisphere, and it's going to ensure the security of the region. So that is the Trump corollary that has been published last year, just a few months ago. So the Monroe Doctrine is now back in force with an extension called the Trump corollary. So now, what's the justification for the invasion of Venezuela and the regime change that they have effected and the abduction of Maduro, etc.? So it's all about democracy, human rights. The US faces national security threats from Venezuela because of Venezuela's alleged involvement with Hezbollah, with Iran, as well as Russia and China, these two evil nations, right? And of course, there's this Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Machado, who is waiting to take over, right? Just like Mohammed Yunus took over in Bangladesh, East Pakistan, right? So that's the narrative. And obviously, Trump has claimed that Venezuela has taken over American oil in some way. So Venezuela, a few years ago, it nationalized the oil industry, okay, but it did not steal anyone's. I mean, by when you nationalize an industry, it means you buy up all the companies that are operating in that industry in your country. You don't capture the companies, you buy them out. So that's what Venezuela had done. And the oil that exists on Venezuelan territory, how is it American oil? I'm not sure, but that's the justification that Trump has given. So, see, obviously, it means that the US actions aren't about democracy, human rights, freedom, peace, etc. It's all about controlling oil. Venezuela accounts for about 20% of the world's proven oil resources. This is about controlling oil. It's about controlling the other resources that you have in Venezuela: lithium, gold, rare earth minerals, etc. Okay, so that's what it's about. So Maduro has been arrested. He will stand trial on criminal charges in the US, and that's the situation. Now, understand the importance and value of Venezuela geopolitically and from a resource perspective, etc. See, Venezuela's share of the world's proven oil resources or reserves is about 18 to 20%. Let's say 1/5 of the entire world's proved oil reserves are in Venezuela. Immensely important, immensely vital. So if in the future, in a few months, let's say the US tries to invade Iran, hypothetically, completely hypothetical scenario, then there could be a major shock in the global oil supply, because Iran is kind of the epicenter. That region, the West Asia region, is the epicenter of the world's oil and energy supplies. Yeah. So if there is an attempted American invasion of Iran, and there's this global oil shock, that oil supplies are disrupted for weeks perhaps, then if the US has Venezuela, then it's going to be secure, and it'll be able to control oil supplies throughout the world. It will be able to decide who gets oil, who doesn't get oil. So that's great. That's fantastic. And so Venezuela, it's about 1/5 of the global oil resources. And the past 5 years, let's say 2020 to 2025, between 65 to 80% of Venezuela's oil exports have gone to China. Okay, 65 to 80%, depending on the year, up and down, up and down. So at the higher end, it's 80% of Venezuela's oil exports going to China. Now, China, China doesn't import oil only from Venezuela, obviously. Russia and Saudi Arabia, these two countries each account for 15 to 20% of China's oil imports. So if Russia is 15 and Saudi Arabia is 15, that's 30%. If it's 2020, it's 40%, that sort of thing. And then you have Malaysia, Iraq, Oman, etc., which also, and if you put Russia and Saudi Arabia in addition to these countries, that's about 2/3 of China's oil imports. So Russia and Saudi Arabia are the top two suppliers for China. Then you have Iraq, UAE, Brazil, Oman, Malaysia, Angola, etc., all these countries. Okay. In Venezuela, Venezuela's share of China's oil imports is about 3 to 5% only, the past 5 years. Okay. But it's still the major place where you have oil reserves. So that's Venezuela and China. Now, what about India? Does Venezuela export oil to India? So in the 2010s, okay, 2010 to 2020, around that time period, roughly, Venezuela provided about 10 to 12% of India's crude oil imports. Okay, so Venezuela was a major oil supplier for India. But then the Americans imposed sanctions, they tightened the sanctions, and this trade came to a complete halt around 2020. Okay, because of US sanctions. And in 2025, India kind of restarted importing a little bit of oil from Venezuela after taking permission from the United States. But it was about 1 to 2% of crude oil imports. Okay, so the US has now essentially, or it's in the process of securing control over Venezuela's oil resources. So this will reduce American vulnerability to any kind of oil energy disruptions in the Gulf. Yeah, it'll provide a buffer to the US in case there are supply shocks, if there's a confrontation with Iran or whatever, right? So that's the deal. And this obviously will lower the economic cost of a confrontation with Iran if Washington decides to go down that road. And this will make any kind of military pressure against Iran more economically manageable, even politically manageable. So this is a great, you could say, master stroke of the US. This is going to reinforce, now that the US controls an additional 20% of the world's oil resources. This will now further reinforce the central role of the United States dollar, the US dollar, in energy markets. This will help preserve the petrodollar system that is the backbone of the global financial system and American financial power, right? So that is the deal. That's the deal right now, as of now. It's just been a couple of hours, few hours since this entire thing happened. Now, what about the other nations? Like Argentina Parao asks, what are the other nations that are aligned with Maduro's government? So, which are the nations in Latin America or in the Americas that are aligned with Venezuela? One is, if you want to talk about the core allies, the core ideological and political allies, there's two. One is Cuba, and the other is Nicaragua. Nicaragua is where the US had conducted a regime change, and they had captured, abducted, whatever you want to call it, Manuel Noriega back in the day. So first, Cuba. Cuba is the land of Fidel Castro, and then later his brother Raul Castro. So Cuba has historically provided political support, intelligence support, diplomatic support, etc., to Venezuela. So Cuba has repeatedly affirmed and publicly affirmed full and complete support for Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro. So that's Cuba. What about Nicaragua? So Nicaragua is ruled by Daniel Ortega. Okay, his government, and he's a long-time actor in the region himself, decades. So Daniel Ortega's government regularly supports and consistently supports Venezuela and Maduro. It rejects American sanctions, Western, European, EU sanctions, etc. And it votes with Venezuela on various regional and multilateral forums. And the West regards Nicaragua as part of this authoritarian anti-US gang with Cuba and Venezuela. Okay, the regional anti-American bloc. That's Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So that is these two nations. Then you also have some other allies like Bolivia and Honduras. And whenever you have left of center governments in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, they have maintained good relations with Venezuela and Maduro, but they also have not been very consistent, entirely, totally consistent in their support of Venezuela. So some of them, see, the 2024 election victory of Maduro, it was disputed by Western nations, and some of these nations did not offer unconditional endorsement of Maduro when he won. So that is the situation. That's the deal. That those are the allies of Venezuela or Maduro in Latin America. So what's going to happen to these countries? That's the question. Is the US going to go and invade them too? Well, you know what? What's the point of invading Cuba? You know what? Cuba has been sitting next door to the US. I mean, just offshore from Florida, if you open the map. And the US never bothered to do a regime change there. Right? And they were able to do a regime change in a couple of hours in Venezuela. So what's the deal? Why did the US never go after Cuba? Well, there's nothing of any real importance in Cuba. The US already has a base on Cuban territory, Guantanamo Bay, right? And there's no oil or any such precious, valuable resource in Cuba. So let Cuba exist and let the, so that's been the kind of approach towards Cuba. And when it comes to the other nations, Bolivia and Nicaragua, etc., once again, there's not a lot that these nations have to offer in terms of resources, etc. So the US will essentially, so the US action in Venezuela is going to serve as an example for everybody else. If you cross the line, this is what happens. If you stand against us, this is what happens. So the other nations will now have to be pragmatic and practical, and they will not really oppose the US too much. And anyway, these small nations, to what extent can they actually, oppose the US in any meaningful way, apart from, moral opposition or verbal opposition? Is there any actual action that they can take that can hurt the US? Not really. So the US essentially is now going to ensure that it completely controls the Western Hemisphere. If there are some dissidents here and there, those will be managed. Um, and this will serve as a reminder to all other nations in the region that you've got to stand, you've got to toe the line. Whatever the US says needs to happen. You can voice some opposition and some dissent here and there, but your actions cannot be in opposition to US interests. So that is the situation right now. And this is a evolving situation. It happened just a few hours ago, 3-4 hours ago. So we'll keep a very close eye on this. And this is going to have global repercussions. It is connected to other conflicts in the world. It is connected to Ukraine. It's connected to the West Asia region. It's connected to Israel, Gaza, Iran. It's also connected to Taiwan. Everything is interconnected. So like I said, the capture essentially of Venezuela gives the US a big buffer against any potential oil shocks, energy shocks that could emanate from West Asia if it tries to do a regime change in Iran. Now, how does Russia respond? How does China respond beyond diplomatic protests, etc.? We'll wait and watch. Yeah, because Russia and China are hard retaliators. They have demonstrated that they are willing, that they're capable of retaliating in a hard, meaningful way, and they're willing to do that. Russia did Ukraine, and China has done all kinds of other things. So let us wait and watch. And we shall revisit this in the same live stream tomorrow in 24 hours' time. Okay, so that's about Venezuela. Very important development. And the US is essentially taking over the Western Hemisphere. It's putting the chess pieces on the board. It's setting the chessboard in the right order so that it can take further action in other parts of the world. Okay.